The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago stood at the funeral of his greatest enemy. What shocked everyone wasn't that he had come. It was that he quietly placed a bouquet of white lilies before the casket and said, "From today on, I will protect his wife." You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss love story. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Rain fell over Graceland Cemetery like a verdict, soft and unrelenting, silvering the black umbrellas that clustered around the open grave. Chicago's underworld had gathered in mourning clothes to bury Marco Rinaldi, and every one of them understood that grief was the least honest emotion in the crowd. They had come to see who else would come. They had come to measure the silence. Isabella Rinaldi stood at the head of the casket in a black dress that had once been her wedding colour, reversed, veil pinned back so the rain could touch her face and no one could accuse her of hiding tears she refused to shed in front of these vultures. Her husband was dead 3 days. 3 bullets, a warehouse on Damon Avenue, a fire that had taken even the walls before anyone thought to mourn the man inside them. She had not been allowed to see the body until the coroner made it presentable, and even then she had recognized him only by the ring on his hand. She heard the cars before she saw them. 3 black Escalades came up the cemetery road in a slow, unhurried line, the kind of arrival that didn't ask permission because it had never needed to. The crowd of Rinaldi men stiffened as one organism. Someone's hand moved toward a jacket. Isabella did not turn. She didn't have to. She knew the sound of Antonio Moretti's cars the way she knew the sound of a gun being racked in another room, a warning etched into her nerves by 10 years of war. He came alone. That was the first thing that unsettled her, more than his presence itself. A man like Antonio Moretti did not walk into enemy territory without an army at his back. And yet here he was, moving up the wet grass in a charcoal coat, with his hands visible and empty, flanked by no one, protected by nothing but the sheer improbability of his own arrogance. The Rinaldi men parted for him the way water parts for something that will drown you if you don't move. Isabella watched him come the way she'd watch a storm cross open water, with the calm of someone who has already decided there is nowhere to run. "Get him out of here," someone hissed behind her. Nobody moved to do it. Nobody was fool enough to put a hand on Antonio Moretti at his rival's own funeral. Not with half of Chicago's law enforcement quietly present in unmarked cars at the cemetery gates, cataloguing every face for a war that hadn't officially started yet. He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough that she could see the rain caught in his dark lashes, the flat, unreadable line of his mouth, the scar that cut through one eyebrow like a hyphen in an unfinished sentence. He was younger than the stories made him sound, 34, maybe 35, but his eyes had the stillness of a much older man, the stillness of somebody who had made peace long ago with the fact that he would likely die violently and had stopped being afraid of it. "You have some nerve," Isabella said, low enough that only he could hear, her voice shaking with something closer to fury than grief. "Coming here to bury the man you murdered." Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that looked almost like restraint. "I didn't kill your husband, Isabella." "Don't!" The word cracked out of her like a whip. "Don't you dare say my name. Don't you dare stand at his grave and lie to me." He didn't answer that. He didn't defend himself further, didn't offer alibis or witnesses or the practiced denials she'd expected from a man who had spent a decade building an empire on the bones of people who trusted him. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a bouquet of white lilies, wrapped simply in brown paper, no ribbon, no card. The kind of flowers a stranger might buy, not the ostentatious wreaths that had arrived from every family in the city trying to purchase forgiveness or leverage in a single gesture. He knelt at the edge of the grave and laid them against the casket with a care that looked absurdly like tenderness. Then he stood, and Isabella watched 40 men hold their breath as Antonio Moretti, the most feared name between here and the Wisconsin border, spoke words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "From today on," he said, quiet enough that it barely carried over the rain, but clear enough that every person present would repeat it within the hour, "I will protect his wife." Then he turned and walked back through the crowd that parted for him again, got into the middle escalade, and was gone before anyone thought to ask him what in God's name he meant by it. Isabella stood over her husband's grave, shaking, not from cold. Around her the whispers began instantly, ravenous, delighted, the kind of scandal that would be currency in every family's war room by nightfall. She barely heard them. She was looking at the white lilies against the dark wood of the casket, stark as a confession, and she was thinking the same thought that would keep her awake for the next several nights. "He killed my husband. And now he thinks he owns what's left of me." She was wrong about the first part. She would spend a long time being wrong about the second. 10 years earlier, the Rinaldi and Moretti families had run half of Chicago between them in an uneasy, profitable peace. Docks and diamonds for the Rinaldis, construction and nightlife for the Morettis, an equilibrium held together by nothing more than mutual restraint and the memory of two fathers who had once been friends before ambition made them rivals. That peace had died on a February night a decade ago, in a hail of gunfire at a warehouse summit meant to renegotiate territory, when someone, no one had ever proven who, opened fire on both delegations at once. 6 men had died that night. Antonio's older brother, Salvatore, had been one of them, 26 years old and 3 weeks from his wedding. Marco Rinaldi's uncle had died beside him, and in the chaos and blood and mutual accusation that followed, both families had reached the same convenient, catastrophic conclusion. The other side had betrayed the truce. Antonio had been 24 when he took over his father's operation, a boy forced into a man's coat by a bullet he hadn't fired. He remembered the years that followed as a single unbroken corridor of retaliation, burned trucks, poisoned shipments, men who disappeared and were found weeks later in the river with their hands bound. He had given the order for some of it himself in the first blind years, when grief and rage had made him as dangerous as anyone accused him of being. He was not innocent. He had never claimed to be. But he had not ordered the death of Marco Rinaldi, and he had certainly not ordered the ambush that started the entire war, because he had lost his own brother in it. What he had discovered, slowly, expensively, through 5 years of quiet investigation that he'd told no one about, not even his own captains, was that the warehouse massacre had not been a betrayal by either family. It had been engineered by a third party entirely. A shadow organization operating under the unremarkable name of Halcyon Trust, a holding company that laundered money for interests far larger and far less visible than either the Rinaldis or the Morettis. Halcyon had wanted the docks. Both families controlled pieces of the waterfront that made large-scale trafficking impossible for outsiders to touch. A war between the two houses, mutual destruction dressed as ancient rivalry, was the cleanest way to clear the board. Antonio had spent 10 years feeding that war, because feeding it kept him alive, kept his people fed, kept the illusion of control intact, while he quietly hunted the real architects in the dark. He had lost track some nights of how much of himself he had given up to keep pretending to be someone's enemy, when his actual enemy walked free behind law firms and offshore accounts, invisible. Marco Rinaldi's death changed everything. Antonio had not ordered it, had in fact received warning of an attack on Marco only hours too late to stop it. A warning from an informant inside Halcyon's security apparatus, delivered by encrypted burner that named a hit team and a warehouse and a time that arrived while Antonio's men were still 4 minutes from arriving. He had stood in that burned building afterward, in a fury he had rarely allowed himself, staring at what remained of a man he had hated for a decade, and understanding, with total clarity, that Halcyon had just executed its end game. Kill Marco, let the Rinaldi family assume it was Moretti retaliation, and watch Chicago's two great houses annihilate each other completely, while the real predator picked over what was left. There was only one problem in their plan: Isabella. She had been present at a security meeting 2 weeks before her husband's death. Marco, careless with his young wife the way powerful men are sometimes careless with people they consider safe, had let her sit in on a call with a man who called himself only the director. She hadn't understood most of what she heard, but she had heard names. She had heard numbers. Somewhere in that conversation was the one loose thread that could unravel Halcyon's entire operation if the right person ever pulled it. And Halcyon knew it. Antonio's informant had confirmed as much within days of Marco's funeral. There was already a team assembling to make certain Isabella Rinaldi never spoke to anyone about what she'd overheard. Antonio had 2 choices: let her die and remain in her eyes and everyone else's the monster who killed her husband, or save her life while she hated him for it and hope that hatred eventually made room for the truth. He had never been a patient man, not in matters of business, but grief had a way of teaching a man patience he didn't know he possessed. And he had 10 years of it now, sharpened into something quiet and terrible and entirely under his own control. He stood at his penthouse window that night, looking out over a city that thought it knew him, turning a burner phone over in his hand, and gave the order that would change both their lives. "Bring her in," he told his head of security, Dante. "Whatever it takes. I don't care if she's screaming. I want her alive." Dante, who had followed Antonio through a decade of war and had never once seen him take a personal interest in an enemy's widow, allowed himself the smallest of frowns. "And if she won't come?" Antonio's reflection in the glass did not change expression. "Then you make sure she doesn't have a choice." They came for her 4 nights after the funeral, and Isabella would later think that 4 nights was exactly long enough for her to have almost convinced herself that the danger everyone kept warning her about was exaggerated grief paranoia, and exactly short enough that she had done nothing to prepare for it. She was in the townhouse on Astor Street that had been Marco's before it was ever hers, packing a box of his cufflinks with the particular numbness of a woman who has cried until crying stopped working, when the alarm panel by the kitchen door chirped once and went dark. She knew, in the half-second before the first window shattered, that it was not a malfunction. 2 men came through the back in ski masks, moving with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this before and expected no resistance from a grieving widow in a house with a disabled security system. What they had not expected was Isabella Rinaldi's mother, who had raised her in Sicily before Chicago and had taught her, among other things, exactly where a woman kept a kitchen knife within reach of a door. She got one of them across the forearm before the other wrenched the knife from her hand and struck her hard enough that the room tilted sideways. She heard herself scream Marco's name, absurdly, uselessly, a dead man's name thrown at the ceiling like it might still answer. Then a hand closed over her mouth, and the world narrowed to fabric and panic and the smell of gun oil, and she understood, with total, drowning clarity, that she was about to disappear the way people in this world disappeared. Quietly, completely, without a body anyone would ever be permitted to bury. The front door came off its hinges instead of opening. She would replay it later in fragments, disordered by adrenaline, the deafening crack of the frame giving way. 3 men in dark tactical gear moving through the house with a coordination that made her captor's entrance look amateur. Gunfire that was shockingly physically loud, in a way movies never captured, the wet-sounding drop of a body 2 feet from her. And then hands, different hands, ungentle but not cruel, pulling the fabric from her mouth, and a voice she recognized instantly, low and controlled, even in the middle of violence, saying only, "Isabella, look at me. You're safe." She looked up into the face of the man who had stood at her husband's grave and promised to protect her, and she screamed at him with everything her body had left. "Get away from me! You did this! You sent them!" Antonio Moretti's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that the accusation landed anywhere at all. "If I'd sent them, you'd already be dead. I'm the reason you're not." Liar! She was sobbing now, furious with herself for it, trying to twist out of his grip as he half carried, half walked her through her own ruined living room, past a body she refused to look at directly, out into a night lit up by more of his men securing a perimeter with the calm precision of a surgical team. "You've been circling me since the funeral. Everyone's talking about it. You want people to think you're protecting me so you can finish what you started. Think whatever you want about me right now." He got her into the back of an armoured SUV, and for one suspended moment their eyes held, hers wet and blazing with a hatred that had nowhere else to go, his dark and unreadable, and, underneath the stillness, exhausted in a way she wouldn't understand for weeks. "But you're not staying in that house tonight, or any night soon. Somebody wants you dead, Isabella, and it isn't me." "Who then?" she demanded. "Who else would want to kill Marco's widow?" Antonio's gaze flicked once toward Dante, who was already moving through the wreckage of her home, collecting shell casings with gloved efficiency, erasing every trace that this had ever happened. When Antonio looked back at her, something had shuttered behind his eyes, a door closing on a room he wasn't ready to show her yet. "That's a conversation for when you're not bleeding from your temple," he said, and reached toward her face with 2 fingers before catching himself, hand dropping back to his side as though he'd remembered, a half-second too late, exactly who he was and what he wasn't allowed to touch. "You need a doctor. Then we'll talk." She wanted to keep fighting him. She wanted to demand answers, throw accusations, claw her way back into a house that no longer held anything of the life she recognized. But the adrenaline was ebbing now, leaving her hollowed and shaking, and when the SUV pulled away from the curb into a city that had just tried to erase her, she found she had nothing left to do but sit in silence beside the man she believed had murdered her husband, and let him take her somewhere she had no way of knowing was safe. The Moretti estate sat on 11 private acres north of the city, behind gates that required 3 separate clearances to pass, and a wall of trees planted decades ago specifically to make the house invisible from the road. Isabella had heard about it the way everyone in her world had heard about it, in rumour, in envy, in the careful vocabulary people used to describe things they'd never been allowed close enough to see. She had imagined something garish. What she found, when the SUV finally stopped under a stone portico at nearly 2 in the morning, was a house so quiet and so deliberately unshowy that it unsettled her more than opulence would have. A woman in her 50s met them at the door, not a servant exactly, though she moved like one, with the brisk, unbothered competence of someone who had run this house through worse nights than this one. "This is Rosa," Antonio said, the first full sentence he'd offered since the drive began. "She'll take care of whatever you need. Anything you don't want to ask me for, ask her." Rosa's eyes swept over Isabella's split lip and the blood drying at her temple, with a wince that seemed genuinely maternal, entirely at odds with everything Isabella had assumed a house like this would contain. "Poverina," she murmured, already reaching for Isabella's arm. "Come, cara. Let's get you cleaned up before that boy makes you sit through an interrogation." "I'm not interrogating her," Antonio said, with the particular flatness of a man mildly offended by an accusation he knew to be at least partially true. "You're standing there like you're about to," Rosa said, entirely unbothered by his tone, and steered Isabella down a hallway lined with photographs Isabella didn't have the composure yet to study, because for the first time since the men in ski masks had broken into her home, someone was being kind to her without asking anything in return, and it broke something loose in her chest that she'd been holding shut since the funeral. She let Rosa clean the cut above her eye in a marble bathroom bigger than her childhood bedroom, let herself be wrapped in a robe that smelled of cedar and someone else's laundry soap. And when Rosa finally left her alone in a guest room with a bed made up in white linen, Isabella sat on the edge of the mattress and cried, the way she hadn't let herself cry at the funeral, in the choking, humiliating way of a person who has been strong for exactly as long as her body would allow it. She didn't hear the knock the first time. When it came again, softer, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "What?" Antonio didn't come in. His voice came through the door, low, careful, the voice of a man testing the strength of ice he didn't trust. "There's food if you want it. Rosa left a tray outside your door either way. You don't have to see me tonight." Isabella stared at the door for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, loud enough to carry. "Just tell me. What do you get out of pretending to save the woman whose husband you murdered?" A silence stretched long enough that she thought he'd walked away. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, quieter, almost private, the register of a confession rather than a defense. "I didn't murder him," he said. "And one day you're going to know that, and you're going to hate that it took you this long to believe me. But I'm not asking you to believe me tonight. Tonight I'm just asking you to eat something and sleep behind a locked door, because the people who came for you today aren't going to stop because they failed once." She heard him move away from the door, unhurried, the tread of a man who had learned, somewhere in a decade of violence, never to make noise he didn't intend. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest for a long time after the footsteps faded, staring at the tray of food steaming faintly on the small table by the door, at the lock Rosa had shown her how to engage from the inside, at the impossible fact of being simultaneously a prisoner and apparently a guarded thing. She thought of the lilies at Marco's grave. From today on, I will protect his wife. She had assumed it was theatre, a performance for the men who whispered behind their hands at the funeral. Lying in an unfamiliar bed in her enemy's house, listening to a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse, she was no longer certain what it had been. She only knew that for the first time in 4 days she felt something other than terror, and she resented Antonio Moretti almost as much for that as she did for everything else she still believed him guilty of. Morning came through gauze curtains in a wash of pale gold, and for one disoriented moment Isabella forgot where she was and reached for Marco's side of the bed before the previous night crashed back over her whole. She lay still, listening to the unfamiliar house breathe around her, a distant clatter of dishes, a dog barking somewhere far off on the grounds, the specific hush of wealth that had learned to make itself quiet. She found Antonio in a sunlit kitchen that looked nothing like she'd expected. No marble excess, just warm wood and a window over the sink that framed a garden gone slightly wild at the edges, herbs growing in uneven rows that suggested someone tended them by hand and not by staff. He was reading something on a tablet, with the stillness of a man who did everything, even breakfast, like it might be his last. And when he looked up at her, the flicker in his expression was so brief she almost missed it. Something like relief, quickly buried under his usual composure. "There's coffee," he said, "and Rosa made cornetti, though she'll pretend she didn't if you thank her for it." "I'm not here for breakfast recommendations." Isabella stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, chin lifted, with the particular defiance of someone who has decided that dignity is the only weapon left to her. "I want to know what happens now. Am I a prisoner?" "You're a guest who isn't allowed to leave the grounds without an escort," Antonio said, with the careful precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed how to phrase this in a way that wouldn't detonate. "Which, I understand, sounds like a prisoner. It isn't meant to. It's meant to keep you alive." "For how long?" "Until I find the people who came for you last night and make certain they can't try again." She studied him across the kitchen, the open collar of his shirt, sleeves pushed up over forearms marked with the pale ghost of an old scar, the watch on his wrist that looked expensive but not ostentatious, the eyes that tracked her with an attentiveness that felt less like surveillance than like a man cataloguing every version of a threat that might come through that door after her. It unnerved her more than hostility would have. "Rules," she said finally. "If I'm staying, I want to know the rules." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. You don't leave the estate without Dante or me. You don't answer calls from unknown numbers. Rosa will get you a new phone today. You don't discuss anything you overheard before Marco died with anyone but me. Not your friends, not your family, not a priest in a confession booth. And you tell me immediately if you remember anything. A name, a place, a number. From that meeting you sat in on 2 weeks before he died. Isabella went very still. How do you know about that meeting? Because that meeting is why someone wants you dead, Antonio said, and for the first time since she'd known him, something in his voice cracked open into something that sounded almost like grief. Marco should never have let you anywhere near it. Whatever you heard that day, Isabella, even the pieces of it that didn't make sense to you, it's the reason you're sitting in my kitchen instead of a grave next to his. The coffee mug in her hands had gone cold. She set it down carefully, aware suddenly of how loud her own heartbeat had become. You keep saying that like you know exactly who wants me dead. If it's not you, then who? Antonio was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like a man deciding how much truth the person could survive at 7 in the morning. A name that isn't going to mean anything to you yet, he said finally. Halcyon. When you're ready, I'll tell you everything I know, but I need you to trust me with pieces first, or you won't believe the whole of it when it comes. Trust you? She laughed, short and humourless, the sound scraping her own throat raw. You stood at my husband's grave. You brought me to your house in the dead of night. You expect me to hand you my trust like it's nothing. I don't expect anything from you. He said it evenly, without heat, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the words cost him more than his voice let on. I told you at that grave I'd protect Marco's wife, and I'm going to keep that promise, whether you believe a word I say or not. Trust isn't the price of my protection, Isabella. It's just something I'm hoping you'll give me eventually, because I'd rather you hate a man who's telling you the truth than love one who lied to you for 10 years. She had no answer for that. She left the kitchen without touching the cornetti, and it was only much later, alone in the guest room with the door locked, that she let herself wonder what, exactly, he had meant by the second half of that sentence, and why it had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs and refused to leave. The estate had its own rhythm, and despite herself, Isabella began to learn it. Rosa woke before dawn to bake. Dante ran the grounds like a soldier running a base camp, walking the perimeter twice a day, with a radio clipped to his belt, and a rifle she was fairly sure he kept within arm's reach at all times, even at the dinner table. And Antonio worked, constantly, relentlessly, in a study at the end of the east wing that she was not invited into and did not ask to enter, though she found herself more than once standing outside its closed door, listening to the low murmur of his voice on calls she couldn't decipher. It was on the 4th day, while she was walking the garden with a Moretti guard trailing 3 respectful paces behind her, that the first attempt came. She heard the shot before she understood it was a shot, a flat crack that didn't sound the way gunfire sounded in films, close and unglamorous, followed immediately by the guards slamming into her and taking them both down into the dirt between the rosemary and a low stone wall. She heard him grunt, felt something warm spread against her shoulder where his weight pinned her, and for one horrifying second she thought the blood soaking through her blouse was her own. "Stay down," the guard hissed, and she realized dimly that he was shielding her body with his, that the wetness against her was his blood, from a graze along his upper arm, and that he had thrown himself over her instinctively, unhesitatingly, the way a man might throw himself over someone he'd been ordered to protect with his life. Antonio reached them before the second shot could come. She would never know exactly how, whether he'd been watching from a window, whether Dante's radio had reached him in seconds, whether some animal instinct honed by a decade of exactly this kind of ambush had put him at a dead sprint across the lawn before the echo of the first shot had finished rolling off the tree line. But he was there, dragging her upright and behind the stone wall with a grip that bruised and a body angled entirely between her and the direction of the shot, his own back exposed to whatever was out there in the tree line beyond the estate's fence. "Get her inside," he barked at the wounded guard, who was already pressing a hand to his own bicep and nodding despite the blood soaking his sleeve. Antonio didn't move from his position shielding her until she was safely behind the wall, until Dante's voice crackled confirmation over the radio that the shooter had been a single operator, already fled through the tree line, no clean shot to be had on their end without exposing more men to open ground. Only then did Antonio turn to her, and what she saw on his face in that moment was not the composed stillness she'd catalogued over the last 4 days. It was something raw and furious and frightened all at once, an expression that looked, disconcertingly, like a man who had just watched something he could not survive losing come within inches of being taken from him. "Are you hurt?" It wasn't a question so much as a demand, his hands moving over her shoulders, her arms, checking for wounds with a thoroughness that had nothing clinical about it. "I'm fine. It's not my blood." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She looked toward the guard, being helped inside by 2 others, his arm wrapped tight. "He threw himself in front of me." "That's his job." "That's not a job, that's—" She stopped, because she didn't have a word yet for what it was, for the strange vertigo of being protected by strangers who had nothing to gain from her survival except a paycheck and loyalty to a man she still half believed was orchestrating her destruction. "Why does everyone in this house act like keeping me alive is worth dying for?" Antonio's jaw tightened. He hadn't let go of her shoulders yet, she realized. His thumbs pressed just slightly too hard against her collarbones, as though some part of him hadn't caught up yet to the fact that the danger had passed. "Because I told them it was," he said finally, "and because in this house what I say is worth dying for tends to actually be worth dying for." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." He released her, stepping back with visible effort, the careful distance of a man re-establishing a boundary he'd nearly forgotten in the panic. "Come inside. We need to talk about what just happened, and I think it's time you heard the rest of what I know." She followed him across the lawn on legs that hadn't quite stopped shaking, past the rosemary bed where a dark stain was already soaking into the soil, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the gunshot had, that whatever came next would change the shape of everything she thought she knew about the man walking beside her. The study, when he finally let her into it, was nothing like she'd imagined during 4 days of listening to its door from the hallway. No trophy wall of violence, no ledger of enemies. Just books, a wall of case files organized with obsessive precision, and a corkboard covered in photographs, financial documents, and red thread connecting names she'd never heard to shell companies she'd never heard of either. "Sit Antonio said, and for once it wasn't a command so much as an offer, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk, while he remained standing, arms crossed, staring at the corkboard like it was a wound he revisited daily out of some private penance. 10 years ago, he began, my brother died in a warehouse ambush that started this war. Everyone assumed it was Rinaldi men who fired first. Your husband's family assumed it was mine. We spent a decade killing each other over an answer neither side actually had. He tapped a photograph on the board, grainy, long lens, a man in an expensive suit exiting a black car outside a nondescript office building. It took me 5 years to find out neither of us was right. This is a man who goes by the name Director. He runs an operation called Halcyon Trust. On paper, it's a holding company. In reality, it's a laundering and trafficking network that needed control of the waterfront both our families held between us. Isabella stared at the thread connecting names, dates, shipping manifests. You're saying someone else started this? That Marco and I spent our whole marriage hating a man who didn't kill anyone? I'm saying your husband and I spent a decade being weapons for someone else's war, and neither of us knew it until it was far too late to stop the bloodshed already done. His voice had gone rough at the edges, and she realized this was the closest she had seen him come to breaking. I lost my brother to this. You lost your husband to it. And Halcyon is still out there, still operating, because as long as the Rinaldis and Morettis kept killing each other, nobody ever looked twice at the company quietly buying up every warehouse and dock contract we couldn't hold on to anymore. Then why kill Marco now, if the war was already doing their work for them? Antonio's expression darkened. Because Marco found something. I don't know exactly what, a shipment manifest, a wire transfer, something that would have led back to Halcyon if he'd pulled the thread far enough. My informant inside their operation warned me 2 hours before it happened. I sent men. We were 4 minutes too late. His hand curled into a fist against the desk, controlled, deliberate, a decade of grief compressed into one small motion. I have spent every day since telling myself those 4 minutes are the reason you look at me like I put the bullet in him myself. Isabella's throat had gone tight. The meeting I sat in on, she said slowly. 2 weeks before he died. Marco let me stay for part of a call because I'd stopped by his office and he didn't think it mattered. I was just his wife. I wasn't going to understand any of it. What do you remember? She closed her eyes, forcing herself back into that afternoon, the sunlight through the office blinds, Marco's voice tense in a way she'd rarely heard, a second voice on speakerphone, cultured, precise, unhurried, in the way of a man who had never once in his life feared consequences. A number, she said, an account number, I think, or a routing code. He said it twice like he was writing it down. And a name, someone called Sable. Marco asked if Sable had confirmed the delivery date, and the man on the phone said Sable's confirmation didn't matter anymore because the buyer had already moved. Antonio had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man who has just heard the missing piece of 10 years' worth of puzzle drop into place. Sable, he repeated. You're sure that's the name? I'm sure. She looked up at him, and something in his face, a controlled, terrible hope, frightened her more than the gunshot in the garden had. Antonio, who is Sable? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had dropped low enough that she had to lean forward to hear it. Sable is the name of the informant who's been feeding me information from inside Halcyon for the last 3 years, he said, which means either your husband's people were talking to my informant without either of us knowing it, or somebody inside Halcyon has known my source's identity long before I ever suspected a leak. The silence that followed felt like the floor tilting beneath her. For the first time since the funeral, Isabella understood that she was not merely a target caught in the crossfire of an old war. She was holding, without knowing it, the one piece of information that could unravel everything, and whoever wanted her dead had known that long before she did. The days after that conversation blurred into a strange, uneasy domesticity that Isabella hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. Antonio doubled the security around the estate, brought in men she didn't recognize who spoke in clipped professional tones and treated her presence with a deference that unsettled her more than hostility would have. And yet within the house itself something had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but a wary détente, the kind that grows between two people forced to share a single roof by circumstances neither of them chose. She found him in the garden one evening, kneeling in the dirt among the rosemary bed that had been disturbed by the shooting days before, replanting the crushed stems with a care that seemed entirely at odds with the reputation that preceded him through every corner of Chicago. "You garden," she said, unable to keep the disbelief out of her voice. "My mother gardened." He didn't look up, working a trowel through the soil with unhurried precision. "She died when I was 12. This is the only thing I remember her teaching me that didn't involve a gun eventually being pointed at somebody." It was the first personal thing he'd volunteered without her asking. Had it landed somewhere in her chest she hadn't braced for. "Marco never gardened," she said, before she could stop herself, the admission slipping out unguarded. "He barely knew what to do with a house. He grew up in hotels. His father thought settling anywhere too long made you predictable." Sounds exhausting. It was. She sat on the low stone wall a few feet from him, watching his hands work the soil, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence comfortable in a way that alarmed her the instant she noticed it. "You said his death wasn't your fault, that you were 4 minutes too late." "I was." "Do you think about it? The 4 minutes?" Antonio's hands stilled over the rosemary. "Every day," he said, and something in his voice had gone rough, unguarded in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "I think about every choice that put my men 4 minutes behind instead of 5 ahead. I think about whether I should have moved on the informant's tip the second it came in instead of confirming it first. I think about a version of that night where your husband is still alive and you're not sitting in my garden, hating me for something I didn't do." He looked up at her then, and the directness of his gaze made her breath catch. "I don't expect that to matter to you. Grief doesn't care about 4 minutes, or whose fault they were, but I think about it every single day." She hadn't expected honesty like that. Raw, unpolished, offered without any apparent hope of absolution. It disarmed her more thoroughly than any denial could have. "Why do you care so much what I think of you?" she asked quietly. "You're Antonio Moretti. Half the city is afraid to say your name out loud. Why does my opinion matter to a man like that?" Something flickered behind his eyes, quickly shuttered, the same careful concealment she'd started to recognize as the thing he did instead of answering a question honestly. Because you're the only person left alive who was in that room when your husband found out the truth, he said instead, deflecting with a half-truth so smooth she almost didn't catch it. Your opinion of me matters because your safety matters. That's all. She didn't believe him, not entirely. There had been a half-second before he composed the answer where something rawer had almost surfaced. But she let it go, because pressing him felt, suddenly, like standing too close to a door she wasn't ready to open. Rosa says you haven't slept properly in a week, she said instead, changing course, watching him for a reaction. Rosa talks too much. Rosa's worried about you. Rosa's worried about everyone. It's a professional hazard of having raised me since I was 15. A ghost of something, almost like a smile, crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Go inside, Isabella. It's getting cold, and you're not dressed for it. She should have gone. Instead, she stayed a moment longer, watching him return to the rosemary with the same unhurried care, a dangerous man on his knees in the dirt, tending something fragile, because his dead mother had once shown him how. And she found herself, for the first time since the funeral, unable to summon the hatred she'd promised herself she would hold on to for the rest of her life. Dante found the lead 3 weeks into her stay, a name, Salazar, tied to the shell company that owned the warehouse where Marco had died, surfacing in financial records that had taken Antonio's forensic accountant nearly a month to untangle. Salazar ran a nightclub downtown called Ember, ostensibly a legitimate business, actually a meeting point where Halcyon's mid-level operators laundered conversation as much as money. "I'm going," Isabella said, the moment Antonio finished briefing her on what they'd found, and the flat certainty in her voice clearly startled him. "You're not. I recognized the voice on that phone call, Antonio. Not the name, the voice. If Salazar is who I think he might be, I'm the only person in this house who can identify him without question. You need me there. I need you alive," he said, sharp enough that she flinched, and he seemed to hear the sharpness himself, exhaling before continuing more evenly. "It's not up for negotiation. You're not walking into a room full of Halcyon's people." "Then I'll walk into it as someone else." She'd clearly already thought this through, and the resolve in her expression told him arguing further would only waste the little time they had. "Dante can dress me up as one of your associates. Nobody at that club has any reason to look twice at a woman on Antonio Moretti's arm. It's the perfect cover. Nobody would ever guess Marco Rinaldi's widow would walk into a room with you voluntarily." He hated that she was right. He hated it more when Dante, damn him, agreed with her. The night of the club, Rosa dressed her in black silk that clung like water, a slit up one thigh that made Isabella feel, for the first time in weeks, like a woman rather than a target. And when she came down the estate's main staircase, Antonio was waiting at the bottom in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who'd been born knowing how to wear them. And the look on his face when he saw her stopped her 3 steps from the bottom. It wasn't lust exactly, though there was plenty of that banked behind his eyes. It was something closer to reverence, quickly and deliberately smothered, the look of a man reminding himself in real time of every reason he wasn't allowed to want what he was looking at. "You look—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and started again with more control. "Stay close to me tonight. Whatever happens in there, you don't leave my side." "I wasn't planning to." The club itself was a study in the particular decadence of dirty money trying to look clean. Velvet, low gold lighting, a bar that served drinks costing more than most people's rent, a crowd that moved with the practiced indifference of people who had learned young never to look too closely at anyone else's business. Antonio's arm around her waist as they crossed the floor felt less like a performance than she'd braced for. It felt, disconcertingly, like something he'd wanted an excuse to do for weeks. She spotted Salazar at the far end of the private lounge before Antonio did. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a diamond signet ring, laughing too loudly at his own joke, and the moment he opened his mouth to greet an associate, she felt the recognition slam into her chest like a physical blow. "That's him," she breathed, gripping Antonio's arm hard enough to bruise. "That's the voice from the call. I'd know it anywhere." Antonio's whole body had gone taut beside her, predator still. "Don't look at him again," he murmured against her ear, the words dropping low and private even as his hand tightened protectively at her waist. "We came to confirm a name, not start a war in the middle of a crowded room. We leave and we plan properly." But before they could turn, Salazar's gaze swept the lounge and landed, with the lazy curiosity of a man cataloguing new faces, directly on Isabella. And something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition dawning slow and unmistakable across his features, as though he too had just placed a voice he'd heard once, weeks ago, on the other end of a phone call he'd assumed no one had overheard. Salazar's recognition lasted only a heartbeat before he masked it behind a practiced smile, but Antonio caught it too, and Isabella felt the shift in his body beside her, the coiled readiness of a man recalculating an exit strategy in real time. "We're leaving," Antonio said quietly, already turning her toward the door with a hand at the small of her back, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Now. Don't run. Walk like we're bored." She matched his pace, forcing her expression into the same practiced indifference she'd watched everyone else in the club wear all night, though her heart was slamming hard enough that she was certain everyone could hear it. They made it halfway across the floor before she felt it, the particular electricity of being watched by more than one set of eyes, the room's temperature seeming to drop despite the crowded warmth of bodies and base. "2 men, 4 o'clock, Antonia murmured. "Don't look." She didn't look. She let him steer her instead, through a side door marked private that led to a service corridor stacked with liquor crates, his hand firm and sure against her back. And the moment the door swung shut behind them, he pulled her flush against the wall in the narrow space, his body angled to shield hers, close enough that she could feel the tension coiled through every line of him. "They made us," he said, low, controlled, scanning the corridor with the flat calculation of a man who had done this 100 times before. "Salazar's people. We have maybe 90 seconds before they check this corridor." "What do we do?" He looked down at her then, and something in his expression cracked open, despite the danger pressing in from every direction, an old, exhausted tenderness that had clearly been building for weeks under all his careful restraint. "We do what people do in a corridor like this when they don't want to be noticed," he said, voice rough. "Nobody looks twice at a couple who can't keep their hands off each other." Before she could ask what he meant, his mouth found hers. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent, desperate, the kind of kiss born out of adrenaline and weeks of restrained proximity finally breaking loose all at once, his hand cradling the back of her head, hers fisting in the lapel of his jacket without her permission. Some part of her mind screaming that this was strategy, This was cover. This meant nothing, even as the rest of her leaned into it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had been trying to kill her for a month. Footsteps passed on the other side of the crates, slowed, then continued on, and only when the sound faded entirely did Antonio pull back half an inch, both of them breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers in the dim gold light of the corridor. "They're gone," he said, voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him. "We need to move, now, before they circle back." She nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and let him lead her through the service exit into an alley where a car, Dante's, she realized, already idling, waited exactly where Antonio must have arranged for it in advance, some careful contingency planned for exactly this outcome. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to the estate. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the window at a city sliding past in smeared neon, aware of Antonio beside her with an intensity that made the silence feel loud, aware that something had shifted between them in that service corridor that couldn't be undone by simply not discussing it. It was only once they were back inside the estate, alone in the front hall while the rest of the house slept, that she finally trusted herself to speak. "That kiss," she said. "You said it was cover." "It was." "Was that all it was?" Antonio was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache. "No," he admitted finally, low and rough, the first fully unguarded thing he'd said to her since the night he'd pulled her from her burning life. "It wasn't all it was, and I think you already knew that before you asked." She didn't have an answer for him. She turned and went upstairs before either of them could say something neither was ready to survive. But she lay awake a long time that night, with her fingers pressed to her own lips, replaying a kiss that had started as strategy and ended as something far more dangerous than any gun aimed at her in a garden. Salazar's people came looking for confirmation 2 nights later, and this time they came for the estate itself. It was Dante who woke her, banging on her door at 3 in the morning with none of his usual controlled calm. "Get dressed, now. We've got movement on the east perimeter, at least 6 men, and Antonio wants you in the safe room." The safe room turned out to be a reinforced study behind a bookshelf that swung outward on silent hinges, a space she hadn't known existed in 3 weeks of living in this house. Antonio was already there when Dante brought her in, a tablet in his hand showing grainy security footage of dark shapes moving through the tree line, his face set in the same terrible stillness she'd seen in the garden the day of the first shooting. "Stay here," he said. "Lock it from the inside. Don't open it for anyone but me or Rosa." "Antonio, I need to go." He was already moving toward the door, checking the weapon at his hip with the efficient unconcern of a man who had done this more times than she wanted to know, and something in her chest seized at the sight of him walking toward gunfire instead of away from it. "Don't," she said, and hated how much it sounded like begging. "Please, send Dante, send anyone. Don't go out there yourself." He paused at the door, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, and she saw a man who wanted, badly, to stay in that room with her instead of walking into the dark. "This is my house," he said quietly. "My people. My promise to you and your husband's memory that nobody who wants you dead gets through that door. I have to go, Isabella. I'll come back." The door sealed behind him, and she was alone with the tablet feed and the sound of her own ragged breathing for the next 40 minutes, watching grainy shapes trade gunfire in the dark, unable to do anything but wait and pray to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in, that the man who had upended her entire understanding of who her enemies were would walk back through that door alive. He did, eventually, bloodied along one forearm from a graze, exhausted but alive. And the moment the bookshelf swung open and she saw him standing there, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him before either of them could stop to consider what it meant. He went rigid with surprise for exactly 1 second before his arms came around her, careful of his wounded arm, holding her like something he'd been forbidden from touching for far too long, and had finally, helplessly, given himself permission to hold. "You came back," she said into his shoulder, muffled, furious with the tears she couldn't stop. "I told you I would." It was in the quiet aftermath of that night, while Rosa cleaned and stitched the wound on his arm at the kitchen table, and Isabella sat across from him, unable to look away, that Dante appeared in the doorway, holding something small and unremarkable. A thumb drive, recovered, he explained, from a lockbox in the Rinaldi townhouse that Antonio's men had quietly retrieved weeks ago during the initial security sweep, only just now decrypted by his tech specialist. "There's an audio file on here addressed to you," Dante said, handing it to Isabella with unusual gentleness. "Time-stamped 3 days before Marco died." Isabella's hands shook as she took a laptop from Dante and plugged in the drive, the kitchen falling utterly silent around her as she clicked play, and the room filled with the sound of her dead husband's voice, tired, urgent, recorded late at night by the rasp of it. A man speaking to a wife he suspected he might not live to speak to again. "Isabella, if you're hearing this, something's gone wrong, and I need you to listen carefully." Marco's voice, warm even through exhaustion, cracked slightly on her name. "I found something I shouldn't have. Something bigger than the Morettis, bigger than this whole stupid war we've been fighting since before you and I ever met. I don't have proof yet, but if something happens to me, if I don't survive this, I need you to trust Antonio Moretti. I know how insane that sounds. I know everything I've taught you to believe about that man, but I've been talking to someone close to him for months, and I believe, God help me, that he's the only person in this city who might actually want the truth as badly as I do. If I don't survive, trust Antonio." The recording ended. The kitchen was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator, and the sound of Isabella's own breath catching in her throat. She looked up at Antonio, who had gone very still across the table, his expression unreadable, and understood, with the particular vertigo of an entire world view collapsing at once, that her husband, the man she had loved, mourned, believed betrayed by the very man now sitting across from her, had left her a message from beyond the grave that upended everything she thought she knew. "He knew," she whispered. "Marco knew you weren't the enemy. He told me to trust you. Before he even died, he told me." Antonio's jaw worked, something raw moving across his face that he didn't bother to hide this time. "I didn't know this existed," he said quietly. "I swear to you, Isabella, I had no idea he'd left you anything." "I know." Her voice broke on the words. "I believe you." It was the first time she had said it out loud, unqualified, unguarded. "I believe you." And the way Antonio looked at her when she said it told her more clearly than any confession could have exactly how much those two words had cost him to wait for, and exactly how much they meant now that they'd finally arrived. Trust, once given, did not arrive all at once, like a door thrown open. It arrived the way morning arrives after a long winter night, gradually, in increments so small she barely registered the shift, until she was standing fully in daylight and couldn't remember exactly when the dark had ended. She found herself seeking him out now instead of avoiding him. In the garden, in the evenings, when he tended the rosemary that had finally recovered from the bullet that grazed it weeks before. In the kitchen, over Rosa's coffee, before either of them was fully awake. In the study, where he'd started, cautiously, to let her look over the case files pinned to his corkboard, instead of guarding them like state secrets. "You could have told me about Marco's recording," she said one evening, watching him work a case file into some new order she didn't yet understand, "the moment you found it. Instead you let Dante hand it to me cold." I thought about it. He didn't look up from the file, but his hands stilled. "I decided if I gave it to you myself, some part of you would always wonder if I'd altered it, staged it. I needed you to hear your husband's voice, with no version of me standing between you and the truth." That's a strange kind of restraint for a man everyone calls ruthless. Everyone who calls me that has never had to earn something they actually wanted. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and when he finally looked up at her, the directness in his gaze made her pulse stutter. "It's easier to take things by force, Isabella. I've done plenty of that in my life, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make myself more palatable to you. But some things, force ruins the moment you touch them. I wasn't going to risk ruining this." "This," she repeated carefully. "What is this exactly?" He set the file down entirely now, giving her his full attention in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. "I think you know what this is," he said. "I think you've known for at least 2 weeks, since a corridor behind Ember, and I think you've been as afraid of it as I have." She wanted to deny it. The habit of hatred was hard to fully abandon, even now, even with her husband's own voice absolving this man from beyond the grave. But denial would have been its own kind of lie, and she was tired, bone-deep tired, of living inside lies other people had constructed for her. "I loved my husband," she said instead, quiet, careful, needing him to understand this before anything else could be said between them. "Whatever this is, whatever I'm starting to feel, it doesn't erase that. It doesn't mean I've forgotten him, or that grieving him and wanting you are supposed to make sense together. I don't need them to make sense." Antonio came around the desk slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to close the distance he was opening between them at whatever pace she needed. "I loved my brother. I've spent 10 years grieving him in the middle of a war I hated fighting. Grief and want aren't opposites, Isabella. They're just 2 rooms in the same house. You're allowed to walk between them." She let him close the last of the distance, let his hand find her jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man capable of the violence she'd witnessed in that dark tree line 3 weeks ago. And when he tilted her face up toward his, The question in his eyes was so plainly, nakedly vulnerable that it undid something in her she'd been holding together by sheer will since the funeral. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice rough, "and I will. I mean that. I've waited this long. I can wait longer. I can wait as long as you need." "Don't stop," she whispered, and closed the last inch of distance herself. This kiss bore no resemblance to the frantic cover story in Ember's service corridor. This was slow, deliberate, both of them fully present and fully aware of exactly what they were choosing, his hands framing her face like she was something rare he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to hold, hers sliding up into his hair to pull him closer, deepening something that had been building, unacknowledged, since a funeral in the rain 3 weeks ago. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both breathing unsteadily, Antonio murmured against her mouth, "I need you to know something, and I need you to hear it clearly, because I'm never going to say it as a manipulation, and I don't want you to mistake it for one." "What?" "I have wanted you since before I understood why," he said. "Long before that funeral. I saw you once, years ago, at a charity gala neither family should have both attended, before the war ever started between us properly, before either of us knew what we'd lose. I never forgot it. I told myself it didn't matter, that you belonged to a world I was at war with, that wanting you was its own kind of betrayal to my brother's memory. I was wrong. Wanting you was never the betrayal. Losing you before I ever got the chance to try, that would have been." Isabella pressed her forehead harder against his, absorbing a confession that rearranged everything she'd believed about the timeline of her own life, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever came next, whatever danger Halcyon still posed, whatever grief still lived unresolved in both their chests, she was no longer capable of walking away from this man, even if some wiser, more careful part of her knew that she probably should. Peace, when it came, was fragile and temporary, and it broke exactly the way Isabella should have known it would. Through an old world neither of them had fully escaped. The gala was Antonio's idea, though he'd hesitated before proposing it. Some annual charity function that half of Chicago's respectable and disreputable elite attended in equal measure, a function he needed to be seen at to maintain the fiction that nothing in his empire had shifted, despite 3 weeks of quiet warfare with an invisible enemy. Isabella had agreed to accompany him before either of them fully considered what it would mean to walk into that room together, publicly, as something other than enemies. The whispers started the moment they crossed the threshold. She felt them like a physical current, eyes cutting toward her, toward Antonio's hand at the small of her back, calculations running behind every carefully neutral expression in the room. Marco Rinaldi's widow on Antonio Moretti's arm, 3 months after her husband's funeral. She had known it would cause a scandal. She hadn't fully braced for how it would feel to stand inside one. It was worse when Victor Salerno approached them near the bar, an old associate of Marco's family, oil-slick and over-familiar, the kind of man who had always made Isabella's skin crawl, even during her marriage. "Isabella!" He took her hand and held it a beat too long, his eyes flicking pointedly toward Antonio with something between amusement and contempt. "I have to say, I never pictured you as someone who moved on quite this quickly, or quite this strategically." "Careful," Antonio said, his voice deceptively pleasant, though Isabella felt his hand tighten fractionally at her waist. No offence meant. Victor's smile didn't waver. Only people are saying all kinds of things. That Moretti here swooped in the moment Marco was in the ground. That maybe he had more reason to want Marco gone than anyone realized, and grieving the widow was always part of the plan. His gaze slid to Isabella with a slow, deliberate insolence. Tell me, does he treat you well, at least? Does he let you out of that estate of his, or are you more of a permanent house-guest these days? Isabella felt the old fury rise in her chest, not at Antonio this time, but in his defence, sharp and immediate and entirely unbidden. He treats me, she said, cold and precise, considerably better than my husband's so-called friends ever managed to, given that not one of you thought to check on his widow after the funeral, beyond wondering how quickly you could pick apart what was left of his territory. Victor's smile faltered, just slightly, and he retreated with a muttered excuse about finding another drink. But the damage of his insinuation lingered in the set of Antonio's shoulders long after the man had gone, a tension she hadn't seen in weeks. You didn't need to defend me, Antonio said quietly, once they'd moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom. I wasn't defending you. I was telling the truth. She studied his face, the careful blankness he'd pulled back over himself like armour. Why does it bother you so much, what he said? You've been called worse by better men than Victor Salerno. Because he's not entirely wrong about how it looks. Antonio's jaw tightened. Half this room believes I orchestrated your husband's death to have you. I've spent 10 years building a reputation men fear for good reason, Isabella, and now half the city is going to whisper that even my grief for your husband's memory was a lie. That this, he gestured faintly between them, was the plan all along. Then let them whisper. She reached up deliberately and straightened his lapel, an intimate gesture that drew more than a few eyes across the room, and that she made without hesitation. I know what's true. Marco knew what was true at the end, or he wouldn't have left me that recording. Everyone else's opinion is noise, Antonio. I stopped being afraid of noise 3 weeks ago in a service corridor behind a nightclub. Something in his expression eased, though not entirely, and later that night, when a different man, younger, brasher, one of Salazar's known associates, she would learn afterward, made the mistake of cornering her near the coat check and gripping her arm a beat too hard, while murmuring something about how a woman like her belonged with men who understood real loyalty, Antonio crossed the room fast enough that Isabella barely registered him moving before the man's wrist was bent back at an angle that made him gasp. Touch her again, Antonio said, quiet and utterly without theatre, in a voice that made the temperature of the entire coat-check alcove seem to drop 10 degrees. And it won't be your wrist you're worried about healing. The man left, white-faced and wordless. Isabella watched Antonio release the tension from his own hand, watched him visibly fight to smooth his expression back into something acceptable for public consumption, and understood, with a shiver that wasn't entirely fear, exactly how much restraint it cost a man like him to stand in a room full of people who doubted him, and not simply burn it down around them both. The break came from Sable. Antonio's informant reached out through the usual encrypted channel 3 days after the gala, requesting an emergency meeting. something Sable had never done in 3 years of careful, arm's-length cooperation, always preferring the safety of distance and dead drops to anything resembling direct contact. Antonio read the message twice at his desk, his expression tightening in a way Isabella had learned to recognize as genuine alarm beneath the composure. "Something's changed," he said when she asked. "Sable never wants to meet in person. This isn't protocol. Something's forced their hand." The meeting was set for a parking structure downtown, deliberately public, deliberately exposed. Sable's choice, meant to discourage any ambush neither party could survive walking away from in front of witnesses. Antonio insisted Isabella stay at the estate. Isabella, for the first time since arriving there, didn't argue, some instinct telling her this was not a night to test the boundaries of his protection. He came back 4 hours later, pale, in a way she'd never seen him, and it took Rosa forcing a glass of scotch into his hand before he would speak at all. "Sable's real name is Elena Marchetti," he said finally, staring at the glass rather than at Isabella. "She's been inside Halcyon's financial operation for 6 years, since before I ever recruited her as a source. She confirmed tonight what I've suspected for months but couldn't prove. The director isn't just laundering money through the docks. He's planning to eliminate every remaining obstacle within the next 2 weeks. Permanently. That includes me. That includes you. That includes Elena herself, the moment they suspect she's compromised." "Why now?" Isabella asked. "Why move now, after 10 years of letting the war do their work for them?" "Because the war is ending." Antonio finally looked up at her, something bleak moving behind his eyes. "You and I sitting in the same room, not trying to kill each other. That's the one outcome Halcyon never planned for. As long as the Rinaldis and Morettis kept bleeding each other, nobody looked too closely at who was really profiting. The moment we start cooperating instead of warring, we become the single greatest threat to everything they've built. Elena says the director gave the order 2 days ago. Full liquidation of loose ends. That's the phrase she used, loose ends. Isabella felt something cold settle low in her stomach. That's us. That's us. Antonio finally set the scotch down, untouched, and reached for her hand across the small distance between them, with a directness that told her he needed the contact as much as she suddenly did. "Elena's given us something we haven't had in 10 years, Isabella. A location. A date. The director is consolidating his most sensitive financial records at a private facility outside the city before he goes fully dark, moving everything to an offshore server that we'd never be able to touch once it's live. If we move before that transfer completes, we don't just survive this, we end it. All of it. The whole rotten architecture that killed your husband and my brother. Gone." "And if we don't move in time?" His grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but with a fierce, protective intensity that answered the question more honestly than words could have. "Then he finishes what he started 10 years ago," Antonio said quietly, "and buries every witness who could ever prove it wasn't our war to begin with. I'm not going to let that happen. Not to you. Not after everything it's cost both of us to get here." She studied his face in the low, steady light, exhaustion carved into every line of it, fear he wasn't bothering to fully hide from her anymore, the particular terror of a man who has finally found something worth surviving for and understands exactly how easily it could still be taken from him. "Then we move," she said, with a steadiness that surprised her. "Together. Whatever this plan is, I'm part of it. I'm done being the thing everyone's trying to protect from a distance, Antonio. Marco died because he tried to fight this alone. I'm not going to let you make the same mistake." He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and helpless warring behind his eyes, and then, very quietly, he nodded, not because he'd been persuaded so much as because some part of him had already known, from the moment she walked into his estate, hating him, that she would never again be a woman content to wait safely behind a locked door while other people decided her fate for her. The facility Elena had identified sat 40 minutes outside the city, a nondescript logistics building registered to a shell corporation 3 layers removed from Halcyon's known name, ringed by security that looked, on the surface, like any ordinary warehouse operation and was, in reality, staffed by men who had killed for the director without hesitation for years. Antonio's study became a war room in the days that followed. Dante running perimeter schematics obtained through Elena's access, a small hand-picked team of Moretti's most trusted men, assembled with the kind of careful vetting that came from 10 years of learning exactly who could and couldn't be trusted with a life. Isabella sat through every planning session now, no longer the fragile widow kept behind a locked door, but an active, insistent presence whose knowledge of Marco's final weeks of investigation kept surfacing details the others hadn't considered. "He kept notes," she said, 3 days before the planned operation, staring at a financial ledger Antonio's forensic accountant had partially reconstructed from the fragments recovered at the Rinaldi townhouse. "Marco, he always kept notes, even when he told me he wasn't working on anything. There's a safe in the townhouse, behind the false panel in his study. I know the combination. If he documented any of this before he died, it's still there." Antonio's eyes sharpened with the particular focus of a man recognizing an opportunity. "That townhouse has been under Halcyon surveillance since the night they came for you. If we send a team in, they'll know within minutes." "Then don't send a team." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "Send me. I have every right to walk back into my own house. Nobody would think twice about the grieving widow returning for personal belongings. It's the perfect cover, and you know it." "Absolutely not." The response came instant, hard, more emotion in it than Antonio usually allowed himself. "I am not sending you back into a house they already tried to kill you in once. You're not sending me anywhere. I'm telling you I'm going, with or without your blessing, because I know exactly where that safe is and exactly what might be inside it, and none of your men know Marco's house the way I do." She reached for his hand, softening only slightly. "I'm not trying to be reckless, Antonio. I'm trying to be useful. I've spent a month being the thing everyone protects. Let me be the thing that helps end this, for once." The argument that followed lasted late into the night, and ended, as most of their arguments had begun to end in recent weeks, not with either of them fully winning, but with a compromise forged from mutual, grudging respect. Isabella would go, but with a full security detail positioned throughout the block, with Antonio himself in the car outside, despite every operational argument that his presence there was unnecessary risk. Because there was no version of this plan he would agree to that didn't include being close enough to reach her if something went wrong. "If anything happens," he said, the night before, both of them lying awake in the dark of his bedroom, where she had, in recent weeks, quietly stopped returning to her own each night. "If I give the order to abort and pull out, you listen. No arguments. No insisting on 30 more seconds to search one more drawer. You come out the moment I say so. I promise. She turned to face him in the dark, tracing the line of the old scar through his eyebrow with careful fingers, memorizing the shape of him the way she'd once memorized Marco's face. Except this memorizing felt different. Not a substitute for grief, but something built alongside it, in the same house, 2 rooms she was finally learning to walk between. Antonio, if something goes wrong tomorrow, nothing is going to go wrong. But if it does, she held his gaze, unflinching. I need you to know that whatever happens, walking into your estate that first night was the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me, and it turned into the safest I've felt since Marco died. I didn't expect that. I certainly didn't want it. But it's true, and I wanted to say it out loud at least once before tomorrow, in case tomorrow doesn't go the way we've planned. Antonio's hand came up to cradle her face in the dark, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted everything the rest of the city believed about him. Nothing is going to happen to you tomorrow, he said, low and fierce, because I have spent 10 years surviving things that should have killed me for exactly one reason I didn't understand until you walked into my life. I wasn't surviving for revenge anymore, Isabella. I was surviving because some part of me was still waiting for something worth staying alive for. I'm not losing that now. Not tomorrow. Not ever. She fell asleep eventually in the circle of his arms, and if either of them lay awake afterward, listening to the other's breathing, memorizing the sound of it against the uncertainty of the coming day, neither said so aloud. The Astor Street townhouse looked exactly as she'd left it a month ago, and nothing like it at all. The broken window from the night of her abduction had been repaired by Antonio's people without her ever asking, the blood scrubbed from the floorboards, and yet the house felt hollow in a way it hadn't even in the immediate aftermath of Marco's death, as though the life that had once filled these rooms had finally, fully, finished leaving. She moved through it quickly, aware of the earpiece pressed against her ear, of Dante's low voice occasionally checking in, of Antonio's silence on the other end that she'd come to understand meant he was watching the block through binoculars from an unmarked car, saying nothing because saying nothing was the only way he could keep himself from breaking radio silence every 30 seconds to ask if she was safe. Marco's study was exactly as she remembered it, dark wood, the smell of old paper, and the cologne he'd worn for 15 years that still faintly clung to the curtains. She found the false panel behind the third bookshelf exactly where she'd known it would be, her fingers trembling only slightly as she entered the combination, their wedding date, absurdly sentimental for a man who'd built an empire on ruthless calculation, and the panel clicked open to reveal a small safe. Inside was a notebook, handwritten, dense with Marco's cramped script, dates and figures and names she recognized now from weeks spent studying Antonio's corkboard. Halcyon, Salazar, an offshore account structure, and at the back, in ink that looked hastily added, a final entry dated the day before he died. I think I've found the director's real identity. Meeting tomorrow to confirm with a contact inside their finance arm. If this is right, it changes everything. Isabella doesn't know any of this. Better that way, for now. If something happens to me, the notebook is the proof. Trust Antonio Moretti. He's been hunting the same monster longer than I have. whether either of us wanted to admit it. "I have it," she breathed into the earpiece, her hands shaking now for an entirely different reason. "Antonio, he identified the director. It's in here." "Get out." Antonio's voice came back immediately, tight with urgency. "Now, Isabella. We'll read every word of it once you're back in the car." She was 3 steps from the study door when the front door downstairs splintered inward. She heard Dante's voice explode into the earpiece, sharp and fast. "Contact! Contact! Get her out through the back! Go! Now!" And then she was moving on pure instinct, notebook clutched to her chest, down the servants' stairs toward the kitchen exit, exactly as Antonio had drilled into her the night before. Her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs as she heard boots pounding through the house behind her. She made it to the kitchen door before a hand closed hard around her arm and spun her back into the room. The man holding her was one she recognized instantly, with a jolt of pure terror. Victor Salerno, the associate from the gala, his oil-slick charm entirely absent now, replaced by something cold and businesslike that told her everything she needed to know about who he'd truly been working for all along. "The notebook," he said, holding out his free hand, his grip on her arm tightening painfully. "Give it to me, and I might let you walk out of this house the same way you walked in." "You," she gasped, the pieces slamming together with sickening clarity. "You've been Halcyon's man inside Marco's own circle. You knew everything. You probably knew about the warehouse before it happened." "I knew plenty." Victor's smile had none of its gala warmth now. "I also know Moretti's men are 3 minutes out, which means I need that notebook in my hand in considerably less time than that." She heard gunfire erupt somewhere near the front of the house, Dante's team engaging Victor's men, the sounds of a firefight she'd hoped never to be this close to again. And in the chaos of it, in the single heartbeat where Victor's attention split toward the noise, Isabella did the only thing she could think to do. She drove her knee up hard between his legs, with every ounce of fury a month of terror had built in her. And when his grip loosened in a strangled gasp of pain, she wrenched free and ran, notebook clutched tight, through the kitchen door and into the alley beyond, exactly as Antonio came around the corner at a dead sprint, gun already raised, murder written plain across every line of his face. He put 2 bullets in Victor Salerno before the man could recover enough to raise his own weapon, and then Antonio's arms were around her, crushing her against him, both of them breathing hard in the narrow alley while gunfire continued to echo somewhere behind them. "I told you to get out the second you had it," he said into her hair, voice ragged with a fear he'd clearly been holding at bay through sheer force of will. "I was getting out." She was shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. "Victor found me first." "I know. I saw." His hands framed her face, checking her for injury with the same desperate thoroughness as the day of the first shooting in the garden. "You're not going back into that house again. Do you understand me? Not for anything. Not ever again." She didn't argue. She let him pull her toward the waiting car, the notebook clutched against her chest like the answer to 10 years of bloodshed. And behind them, Dante's team finished securing the block, while sirens rose distantly in the night, converging on a scene that would take considerable resources to explain away, and that Antonio's people would, by morning, have already made disappear. They read the notebook together at the estate that night, Isabella curled against Antonio's side on the study sofa, while Dante stood by the fireplace, all of them absorbing the weight of what Marco had uncovered in the final days of his life. The director's real name was Julian Cassavetes, a name that meant nothing to Isabella, but made Antonio go rigid the instant he read it aloud, his face draining of colour in a way she'd never seen, not even during the worst of the firefights. "I know that name," he said quietly. "Cassavetes was my father's business partner before I was born, before either of our family's current territories were even established. He disappeared from Chicago's underworld 30 years ago. Everyone assumed he'd retired or died or simply lost interest in a business that had gotten too dangerous even for him." His hands tightened on the notebook. "He didn't retire. He went underground and built something bigger than either family ever imagined, and he's been quietly orchestrating our mutual destruction from the shadows for a decade, using a war that started with my brother's death to clear the one obstacle standing between him and total control of the waterfront." "Marco's notes say he had a meeting scheduled to confirm this," Isabella said, flipping to the final page. "With a contact inside Halcyon's finance arm. Someone who could verify Cassavetes' identity beyond doubt." "Elena," Antonio said slowly, understanding dawning grim and complete across his face. "It has to be. Marco must have found his own way to her, independently of me, in those final weeks, which means Cassavetes may already suspect there's a second leak beyond the one he's been hunting for months. If he connects Marco's meeting to Elena, then she's already dead, or she's about to be." Dante's voice was flat, urgent. "We need to move up the timeline. Whatever transfer Cassavetes was planning at that logistics facility, if he knows we're closing in on his identity, he'll accelerate it. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest." Antonio was already moving, pulling up secure lines to his team, his voice shifting into the clipped, commanding register Isabella had learned meant every ounce of his attention had narrowed to a single objective. She watched him coordinate a dozen moving pieces with a competence that would have terrified her a month ago, and now, strangely, steadied her. This was a man who had spent 10 years surviving impossible odds, and she trusted, with a certainty she hadn't expected to ever feel again, that he would survive these, too. "I'm coming with you," she said, the moment he finished his calls. "Isabella, don't!" She stood, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that silenced whatever objection he'd been building. Marco spent the last weeks of his life trying to expose this man. He died before he could finish it. "I'm not going to sit in this house while you finish what my husband started without me there to see it through. This is my fight too, Antonio. It's been my fight since before I even understood what I was fighting." He studied her for a long moment, something fierce and reluctant, and underneath it, deeply proud, moving across his features. "You stay in the car," he said finally, "behind Dante's line, with 2 men on you at all times. If I say retreat, you retreat. No arguments, no 30 more seconds. Say it back to me." "I retreat the moment you say so. Say it like you mean it." "I mean it." She reached up and kissed him, quick and fierce, a promise sealed against his mouth in the flickering firelight of a study that had become, over the past month, something closer to a home than the townhouse she'd once shared with a different man in a different life. "Now let's go end this." Within the hour, a convoy of Moretti vehicles moved through the dark toward the logistics facility outside the city, carrying a small army assembled from 10 years of survival. A widow who had once believed the man beside her murdered her husband, and a notebook that held, at long last, the name of the true architect of a war that had cost them both everything they'd ever loved. The logistics facility sat black and silent against the tree line, floodlit at its perimeter, but dark within. Exactly the kind of stillness that told Antonio, the moment his convoy rolled to a stop a quarter-mile out, that something had already gone wrong. "Too quiet," he murmured to Dante, both of them scanning the building through binoculars. "Cassavetes should have 20 men on that perimeter. I count 6. Maybe the transfer already happened. Or maybe he knows we're coming and he's already gone, and this is a trap for whoever shows up looking for him." Antonio's jaw tightened. He glanced back toward the second vehicle, where Isabella sat flanked by 2 of his most trusted men, and something in his chest twisted at the sight of her, steady and resolved despite the danger, waiting for whatever came next, with a courage he hadn't expected to fall in love with quite this completely. They moved in staggered formation, Dante's team taking the north perimeter, while Antonio led a second team through the loading bays on the south side, the facility's interior a maze of shipping containers and half-lit corridors that smelled of diesel and old paperwork. They found the finance operations server room exactly where Elena's intelligence had promised. Banks of humming machines, a transfer already 40% complete on the main terminal, technicians who fled the moment gunfire announced Antonio's team had breached the perimeter. They found Elena Marchetti in the room beside it, alive, zip-tied to a chair, her face bruised, but her eyes sharp with relief the instant she saw Antonio come through the door. "He knows," she said immediately, the words tumbling out fast, even as Antonio cut the ties binding her wrists. "Cassavetes knows there's a second leak. He questioned me himself an hour ago. I don't know what I gave up before I stopped answering, Antonio. I'm sorry. I tried to hold out. You're alive. That's what matters." He helped her to her feet, urgency sharpening every movement. "Where is he now?" "Command office, 3rd floor. He has men with him. He was planning to be gone before the transfer even finished, using it as bait to see who came looking." Elena's gaze moved past Antonio toward the door, and something in her expression shifted. "Antonio, he knows about her too. About Isabella. He's been watching the estate for weeks, waiting to see if the widow was actually cooperating with you, or if you were just using her as bait of your own." The radio at Antonio's hip crackled before he could respond, Dante's voice tight with alarm. "We've got a problem. Second vehicle's been flanked, 6 men moving in from the tree line on the east side, and they're not aiming for the facility. They're aiming for the car." Antonio's blood went cold. Isabella. He was moving before the thought fully formed, sprinting back through the maze of containers with a speed that left even Dante's radioed warnings trailing behind him, every instinct in his body screaming a single directive that overrode 10 years of careful, controlled violence. Get to her, get to her, get to her. He broke into the open lot in time to see one of his own men down, the second dragging Isabella bodily toward the cover of the vehicles, while 3 of Cassavetes' men closed the distance with weapons raised, and in the half-second before his mind caught up with his body, Antonio understood with total, terrible clarity that he was about to watch the thing he loved most in the world die in the open, because he had been 30 seconds too slow. Exactly the way he'd been 4 minutes too slow for her husband. Exactly the mistake he had promised himself, promised her, he would never make again. He fired without conscious thought, dropping the nearest attacker before the man could complete his turn, closing the remaining distance in a dead sprint that ignored every principle of tactical caution he'd spent a decade drilling into every man under his command. Because there was no version of caution that mattered more than reaching her before the next bullet found its mark. Isabella saw the moment shift before she understood it. Saw Antonio break from the tree line at a speed that seemed impossible for a body to sustain. Saw the second attacker's rifle swing toward him instead of her, the instant he became the more immediate threat, and felt her own scream tear out of her throat before conscious thought caught up to instinct. "Antonio, look out!" He heard her. She would think later that some part of him had been listening for her voice specifically, tuned to it the way a man tunes himself to the one frequency that matters in a room full of noise, because he twisted at the last possible instant, and the bullet that would have taken him centre mass instead tore through his shoulder, spinning him half around with the force of the impact. He didn't go down. She would remember that detail for the rest of her life, that even shot, even bleeding, Antonio Moretti did not fall, closing the last of the distance between himself and her attacker with a fury that ended the confrontation in 3 brutal seconds, the man crumpling before he could bring his weapon fully back to bear. Then Antonio turned, swaying slightly, blood already soaking dark through his shirt, and Isabella was running to him before she'd made any conscious decision to move, catching him as his knees finally buckled, both of them sinking together to the cold ground of the lot, while Dante's team finished securing the perimeter around them. "You're hit." Her hands were shaking as she pressed against the wound, blood hot and slick between her fingers, terror closing her throat around every word. "Antonio, stay with me. Do you hear me? Stay awake." "I'm not going anywhere." His voice came rough, strained, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face with a clarity that refused to waver even through obvious pain. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm fine." "You're the one bleeding on the ground because you decided jumping in front of a bullet was a reasonable plan." It was the only plan. A ghost of something almost like his usual composed half-smile crossed his face, despite the grey pallor spreading beneath it. "You're worth considerably more than my shoulder, Isabella. I'd make that trade again in half a heartbeat." "Don't say that." Her voice cracked entirely now, tears mixing with the blood on her hands as Dante's medic arrived, pressing gauze against the wound with the efficient calm of a man who had done this too many times before. "Don't you dare talk like you're bargaining with your own life, like it's worth less than mine. I can't lose you too. Do you understand me? I have already buried one man I loved. I am not doing it again." "Not you. Not like this." Something in his expression shifted at that. Beneath the pain, beneath the greying edges of shock creeping into his features, a fierce and startled tenderness that told her the words had landed exactly where she'd aimed them. "Say that again," he murmured, as the medic worked and Dante barked orders for an evac vehicle. "When I'm not half delirious from blood loss, say it again so I know I actually heard it." "I love you." The words came out of her without hesitation, without the careful qualification she'd been building around every feeling for weeks, true and unguarded and entirely certain in a way that surprised her even as she said it. "I love you, Antonio Moretti, and if you die on me in this parking lot after everything we've survived to get here, I will find a way to bring you back, just to be furious at you for it." He laughed, weak and pained, and utterly delighted, despite the blood soaking through the gauze at his shoulder, and reached up with his uninjured arm to pull her down enough to press his mouth briefly, imperfectly, against hers. "I love you," he said against her lips. since a garden with a bullet-shredded rosemary bed, if I'm honest with myself. Possibly since a funeral in the rain, if I'm being entirely honest, though I didn't understand what I was feeling yet. Then don't you dare leave me now that we both finally said it. I don't intend to. His eyes were losing focus now, shock finally overtaking him, despite his effort to stay present, but his hand found hers and held on with what strength remained. "Cassavetes," he managed, voice fading. "Third floor, command office." "Dante, I've got it," Dante said grimly, already moving, already barking new orders into his radio as the medical team lifted Antonio onto a stretcher. "Get him to the vehicle. I'll finish this." Isabella climbed into the ambulance beside him, refusing every suggestion that she ride separately, holding his hand through the entire tense drive to Antonio's private physician, while somewhere behind them, in a command office on the third floor of a logistics facility that had hidden a decade of orchestrated bloodshed, Dante's team closed in on the man responsible for all of it, and the war that had defined both their lives finally, at long last, reached its ending. Cassavetes did not go easily. Dante's team found him in the command office, attempting to burn what remained of his physical records, a fire already licking at a metal trash can when they breached the door. And in the brief, brutal exchange that followed, the man who had orchestrated 10 years of bloodshed between two families that had never truly been enemies died with considerably less ceremony than he had engineered for everyone else. Elena Marchetti's testimony, combined with Marco's notebook and 3 years of Antonio's own patiently gathered evidence, would eventually unravel Halcyon's entire network down to its last shell company, a process that took months of careful, quiet work through channels that never touched a courtroom, because some forms of justice, in the world Isabella now lived in, were dispensed by men who understood consequences better than any judge could. Antonio survived his wound, though the recovery was slower than either of them wanted. 3 weeks of Isabella refusing to leave his side, except when Rosa physically ushered her out to sleep. 3 weeks of watching colour slowly return to a face that had gone grey in a parking lot she still dreamed about some nights. He healed the way he did everything, with a stubborn, quiet determination that refused pity and accepted her care only because, as he told her once, low and honest in the dark of his bedroom, he had finally found something worth being patient for. 6 months after the funeral in the rain, Isabella stood again at Graceland Cemetery, this time without the crowd, without the whispers, just herself and Antonio at her side, laying a fresh bouquet of white lilies against a headstone that finally, at long last, bore an accurate accounting of the truth. "I came to tell you something," she said quietly to the stone, Antonio's hand steady in hers. "The man you told me to trust. I trust him completely now. I love him, Marco. I think some part of you already knew I would, or you wouldn't have left me that recording. I hope, wherever you are, that brings you some peace. It's brought me more than I ever expected to find again." Antonio said nothing, giving her the silence she needed, but his hand tightened around hers in a way that said everything he didn't need to speak aloud. That he understood grief and love could occupy the same house without either one diminishing the other. That he would spend the rest of his life honouring both the man Isabella had lost and the woman she had become in the aftermath of that loss. "Cassavetes is gone," she said eventually, turning from the grave. "Halcyon is finished. The war is over, Antonio, really over this time, not just paused between one act of retaliation and the next. It is. He drew her against his side as they walked back toward the car. The Chicago sky overhead grey but calm. No rain today, no funeral procession, just two people who had survived something neither of them fully expected to live through. 10 years of war, ended by a widow who refused to stay hidden behind a locked door. Ended by a mafia boss who laid lilies at his enemy's grave and meant every word of what he said over it. She looked up at him, and the smile that broke across her face held none of the caution that had defined every interaction between them for the first weeks of their acquaintance. Only the open, unguarded warmth of a woman who had finally, fully, let herself be happy again. You kept your promise, you know. From today on, I will protect his wife. You did, every single day since. I intend to keep keeping it, Antonio said, low and certain, stopping at the car to draw her fully into his arms, indifferent to the quiet cemetery around them, to the 10 years of blood that had led them both to this exact moment. For considerably longer than either of us originally expected, if you'll have me. I'll have you, Isabella said, and kissed him there among the headstones, in the same cemetery where he had once knelt to lay white lilies before a dead man's casket, and changed the entire shape of both their lives with a single, quiet vow. A vow that had begun as penance and ended, against every reasonable expectation either of them once held, as love. Chicago's underworld would spend years afterward telling the story in careful, half-believing whispers. How the most feared boss in the city had fallen for his greatest enemy's widow. How a war a decade in the making had ended not with more bloodshed, but with a marriage that united what violence had once torn apart. How the woman who once spat hatred at his feet in the rain became the only person alive who could soften every hard edge he'd built around himself since his brother's death. Some would call it scandal, others would call it fate. Isabella, when asked years later by a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's watchful stillness, would only ever say the same thing, holding Antonio's hand the way she had held it through every danger that had ever tried to separate them. "Your father made me a promise at a funeral," she would say, smiling at the man across the room who still, after everything, looked at her like she was the only steady thing in a world built on violence and grief and impossible second chances. And he has never once, in all the years since, broken it.